Qualcomm has released the new Snapdragon control panel, a software utility for gamers that is similar to NVIDIA's GeForce experience and AMD's Adrenal software. There have also been some updates to the Microsoft Prism emulation layer, which promise better game performance. And these updates were significant enough that The Verge declared Windows on ARM is now ready for gaming. But is it really? Well, I decided to put it to the test. And to do that, I've enlisted two different laptops, the Microsoft Surface Laptop 7 13.8 inch and the HP OmniBook 514. Now the Surface Laptop is close to the top tier performance for Qualcomm Snapdragon X Elite chips. It has the X1E-80-100 chip with 12 CPU cores and the Qualcomm Adreno X185 integrated GPU that promises performance up to 3.8 teraflops. It represents what you can expect from a flagship Qualcomm Snapdragon X Elite laptop right now. The other laptop I'm testing is the HP OmniBook 514 with the Snapdragon X Plus X1P-42-100. This sits much lower in Qualcomm's product stack, so it only has 8 CPU cores and serves up Adreno X145 graphics with a much lower quoted performance figure of 1.7 teraflops. The HP OmniBook 514 is one of my favorite budget Windows laptops right now, and its performance is representative of what you can expect from similar Qualcomm laptops in the $500 to $750 price bracket. Now, I did install the new Snapdragon control panel on both of these laptops, but something I just want to quickly note is that would not launch on the Microsoft Surface laptop. I did, however, manually download the latest Adreno GPU driver on the Microsoft Surface laptop, so the performance should be the same as it would have been if the software was successfully launching. Okay, so with that said, let's get into the test, starting with 3D Mark Night Raid. This is a less demanding benchmark that provides a native ARM version. And the results here are crystal clear. The HP OmniBook 514 scored about 15,500, while the Microsoft Surface Laptop 7 scored about 23,250. That is about a 50% boost in favor of the Surface, which is huge. But how does this compare to laptops with Intel Arc or AMD Radeon integrated graphics? Well, I frequently review laptops with these IGPs for PC World, where I write reviews as a freelancer, so I do have some results to pop in. The Asus VivoBook 16 Flip with Intel Arc 140V scored about 35,500 in this test. The Dell 14 Plus 2-in-1 with AMD Radeon 840M scored 17,260, and the Asus ZenBook S16 with AMD Radeon 880M scored about 24,500, while the Asus ProArt P16 with AMD Radeon 890M scored about 40,000. So yeah, these results will vary quite a bit depending on the exact IGP in the laptop you want to buy, but the Qualcomm Adreno IGP is generally on the bottom half of the results. Now, let's move on to 3D Mark Still Nomad Lite, which also has native Windows on ARM support, and which is generally a more demanding test than the Night Raid benchmark. And here we see the gap between the two laptops widen, as the Surface laptop roughly doubles the performance of the OmniBook. That suggests the OmniBook's performance could struggle in more demanding games, although we will see more on that in the actual game tests. So why don't we go ahead and try some actual games, starting with Dota 2. Now, a quick reminder, the 3D Mark benchmarks are native Windows on ARM benchmarks. However, most of the games that are available on Windows today are not native for Windows on ARM. So that means most of the games I'm going to be testing here are running through the Microsoft Prism emulation layer, which debuted in the Windows 11 24H2 update. Now, I think it's fair to say Dota 2 is the least demanding game I am going to test, and it ran at 1080p resolution in the lowest detail setting. I saw an average of 67 frames per second on the OmniBook and roughly 87 frames per second on the Surface. And while the game did take some brief tours under 16 frames per second in combat on the OmniBook, the overall experience was quite playable. Next up is the Elder Scrolls V Skyrim, which I tested at 1080p resolution and medium settings. This game is pretty old at this point, so it'd be reasonable to expect at least acceptable performance. But that's not what I saw on the OmniBook, which averaged about 32 frames per second. The Surface, however, managed a much better 54 frames per second. One thing to keep in mind here is that Skyrim plays best with VSync enabled, which means it would cap the frame rate at 60 frames per second on these systems. And that's not something you normally would do while benchmarking, but this game can encounter problems if you go the trouble of disabling VSync, so I left it on. In any case, I would say this game is playable on the Surface laptop, but not so much on the OmniBook. Now, next up, we have the MMORPG Final Fantasy XIV, a personal favorite of mine, which I tested using the Dawntrail benchmark at 1080p resolution with laptop standard settings, AMD FSR, and dynamic resolution enabled. The Omnibook averaged 34 frames per second in this game, while the Surface managed a more playable average of nearly 44 frames per second. However, I did notice some pretty serious stuttering issues, which seem to occur most often when moving across the game world. This does not seem to persist when I rerun the benchmark or when I load into an area a second time in the same play session, but when I reboot the laptop and then run the benchmark or load the game again, the problem will again appear in the same area. And that unfortunately can make it pretty annoying to play the game at times, particularly if you're moving between different zones, which you oftentimes are going to do in Final Fantasy XIV. Next up, we have the odd case of Sid Meier's Civilization VI. It's odd because Civ 6 was released on platforms powered by ARM years ago, including Apple's iPad and the Nintendo Switch. But the game doesn't have native Windows on ARM support, and given its age, I suspect it probably never will. That turns out to be a big problem when it comes to performance because even at 1080p and low settings with 4x MSAA enabled, the Omnibook could only average about 16 frames per second, and the Surface averaged only 21 frames per second. The results from the Surface are basically identical to what I saw when I tested the game in the summer of 2024, so Qualcomm's driver updates have not provided much improvement here. Now we move on to Cyberpunk 2077, a game you might not really expect to be playable on Qualcomm's integrated graphics, even at 1080p resolution, low settings, and with AMD's FSR 2.1 performance mode turned on. And you would be right. Using the in-game benchmark, the Omnibook only averaged 21 frames per second, and the Surface averaged a bit over 30 frames per second. To make matters worse, this is not a playable 30 frames per second, as the game takes lengthy detours into the mid and sometimes even low 20s. There's really not much else to say here. It's a very unpleasant experience. Next up, we're turning our attention to Crusader Kings III, a grand strategy game that I've been playing quite a bit recently, and like other games developed by Paradox, it has a rather unique visual presentation with a big strategic map. But there's also a lot of 3D rendered players and NPC characters, so while it looks simple at first glance, it can actually be pretty demanding. The HP Omnibook 5 noped out of this game rather hard with an average of only 18 frames per second. The Surface did quite a bit better, with an average of 32 frames per second, which I'd say is just about playable. The Surface does take detours into the low 20s at times, but because of how this game plays, occasional dips are more tolerable. I did run into a few odd issues in this game where it seemed like texture did not load, and that was actually good news for performance because when that happens, I saw frame rates into the mid 70s, but of course it looked terrible. On top of that, I noticed the Paradox launcher threw up errors whenever I started the game that seemed to be caused by the launcher failing to update. So there are quite a few issues in this game, and of all the games I tested, this was the one where I experienced the most noticeable problems and bugs. Next up is Fortnite, and before we get into the results, I want to clarify an important point. As you may have seen in the recent headlines, Fortnite is now playable on Windows on ARM laptops that have Qualcomm Snapdragon hardware. However, Fortnite does not yet have a native Windows or ARM client. What has happened here is that Epic updated the Easy Anti-Cheat service to allow Windows on ARM laptops running Snapdragon hardware to play the games protected by it, including Fortnite. But the actual game is still an x86 application. So with that said, how does it perform? Well, to start off with, I tried the game at 1080p in the performance rendering mode with medium view distance and textures. And at these settings, Fortnite ran pretty well with an average of about 78 frames per second on the Omnibook and 89 frames per second on the Surface. I saw some frame rate dips down to about 30 FPS, but they were pretty rare and generally related to loading the level or switching to the spectator view after death. So, not a bad experience. Switching to the DirectX 12 rendering mode really tanked performance, even at medium settings and with FSR low engaged. The Omnibook averaged about 21 frames per second and the Surface averaged about 24 frames per second. One thing I find odd here is the relatively small performance gap between the Omnibook and the Surface. To me, this strongly suggests there is some other bottleneck besides the GPU that is coming into play here. Maybe it is even an issue with the Prism emulation. Now, to wrap things up, I wanted to try out at least one major game that does provide native Windows on ARM support, and that is World of Warcraft. So, what does that mean for performance? Well, great things actually. I fired up the game at 1080p resolution with the game quality preset to the middle value, which is 5, and FXAA high turned on. I spent my time testing in Stormwind and doing some starting content both in Elwynn Forest, and also I tried the Bit of the Dragonflight expansion. In this scenario, the Omnibook managed to average about 49 frames per second, and the Surface beat 102 frames per second. And in both cases, the game felt very smooth, with the Omnibook dipping to only 30 frames per second at its worst moments, and the Surface dipping no lower than 72 frames per second. And I think it goes to show that the Qualcomm Adreno IGP can perform well enough if a game has a Windows on ARM executable available. Okay, so those are the results, but what can we make of all this? Well, one thing I think is very clear, and that's that the Qualcomm Snapdragon X chips are generally not a great choice for PC gaming right now. In fact, they're probably the worst choice you could make overall, with the exception of extreme low budget CPUs like, say, the Intel Pentium N4500. The problem, however, is not so much with the Qualcomm Adreno IGP hardware itself, as shown by tests like 3D Mark Knight Raid in, Steel Nomad Lite, as well as World of Warcraft. Qualcomm's hardware can be roughly competitive with Intel and AMD integrated graphics when a Windows on ARM version of the software is available. Now, the big question is when the Windows gaming ecosystem will move to make Windows on ARM support standard, or at least more common. There have been some moves in that direction. Epic recently updated Easy Anti-Cheat to support Windows on ARM, which makes the games that use it, like Fortnite, playable. On top of that, Microsoft has added the option to download ARM64 versions of games through the Xbox Store, though to be clear, that will only matter if a game has a Windows on ARM build to offer, and a lot of them do not. But let's be real here. What matters most is Steam, and Steam does not support Windows on ARM at this time. There's simply no way to download an ARM build of a game through Steam for Windows, at least not as of November 2025. And honestly, given Valve's focus on SteamOS and x86 hardware, it's hard to see that changing in the near future, though to be clear, that is just my guess. Oh, and what about the new Snapdragon control panel software itself? Well, honestly, it's kind of a nothing burger. I mean, it is better than not having any software at all, I guess. It lists the games you have available, it provides an easy way to download drivers, and includes options to tweak things like MSAA on a per-game basis, but that is just about it. Looking ahead into 2026, Qualcomm plans to launch the Snapdragon X2 chips, which will include a major GPU upgrade. In fact, Qualcomm claims that games will be up to 50% quicker than on Intel Core Ultra Series 2 laptops, and 29% faster than AMD Ryzen AI 9 laptops. Now, those are impressive claims, but right now on the existing Snapdragon X Elite and Snapdragon X Plus chips, game performance is still pretty spotty. Contrary to the general doom and gloom of these results, my opinion is that Qualcomm is doing as well as can be expected, and I actually recommend a lot of laptops with Snapdragon X hardware inside, including the HP OmniBook 14, which I reviewed in a previous video. But if you want to play games on your Windows PC, even if they are older and less demanding games, you should probably stick to x86 laptops for now. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.